The great hall was warm with firelight, but the king's hands were cold. Charles the Bald sat on his throne, his crown heavy upon his head, as the chamberlain ushered in a rider from the north. The man staggered forward, mud spattered up to his knees, his chest rising and falling in desperate gasps. He fell to one knee, voice trembling. "They've been sighted," he said. The room fell silent. Even the crackle of the hearth seemed to hold its breath. "Dragon-proud ships," the messenger whispered. "Dozens. No, scores. The horizon is black with them." It was the same nightmare told in countless courts across Europe during the 9th century. Coastal towns would wake to the thunder of drums and the low, bone-deep beat of the war horn. The mist would part, revealing ships with snarling carved beasts on their prows, cutting through the waves like predators. And somewhere on those ships, directing the storm, was a man whose name carried the weight of legend and fear alike, Bjorn Ironside. The Europe of Bjorn's time was a fractured, restless continent. The mighty empire of Charlemagne had splintered into smaller, often warring realms. Francia, once a beacon of power, now teetered under the strain of rival kings, treacherous nobles, and a church struggling to hold sway over a scattered, frightened populace. Rivers were the lifelines of trade and agriculture, but they were also open doors for the longships that could slip silently into the heart of the land. The raids had started generations earlier, sporadic, opportunistic strikes by small bands of Norse warriors. But by the mid-800s, these attacks had evolved into something far more organized, far more dangerous. Viking fleets no longer came merely to plunder, they came to conquer, to extort tribute, and to return again and again, like a tide that could not be turned back. And among these raiders, one name began to rise above all others, not merely for his ferocity, but for his cunning, Bjorn Ironside. Bjorn Ironside was no common warlord. He possessed a gift for strategy rare among his people, and an audacity that made kings hesitate before challenging him. The chronicles of the time speak in tones of awe and dread. In the monasteries, monks wrote by candlelight of harbors choked with ships, of fire devouring towns in the night, of the screams of captives carried off into the cold northern fog. But they also speak of something more unsettling, an almost supernatural sense of inevitability. Bjorn did not simply appear where he was expected, he appeared where no one imagined a fleet could go. Imagine being a Frankish fisherman on a still, grey morning. The tide is low, the river calm. You cast your nets, thinking only of the day's catch. Then, faintly at first, you hear it, a deep, resonant thud, like a heartbeat in the mist. The sound grows, joined by the crash of oars and the hiss of hulls slicing through water. Shadows emerge, resolving into vast shapes, ships long and narrow, their sails like blood in the dawn light. And at the prow of the lead vessel stands a man in a cloak of furs, his hair catching the wind, his eyes fixed on the shore. No prayer could stop him. No wall could keep him out. Bjorn's reputation was not built on brute strength alone, but on the precision with which he wielded terror. His raids were timed to exploit moments of political weakness, when kings were distracted by rivals, when harvests had failed, when armies were far from home. He understood the value of striking not just at fortresses, but at the symbols of his enemy's power. A burnt monastery was not only a loss of treasure, it was a blow to the soul of Christendom. And yet, for all his ruthlessness, he was also a master of negotiation. There were times when Bjorn would withdraw without a battle, after extracting a ransom so vast it could fund the next campaign many times over. To some, this made him more dangerous than the warlords who sought only slaughter. He was a predator who could be patient, who could wait for the perfect moment to strike again. In Paris, in Rouen, in the ports of Aquitaine, his name was spoken like a curse. Kings held councils in candlelit rooms, debating whether to fight or to pay. Lords fortified riverbanks and built watchtowers, but each defense was only a delay. The Vikings had mastered the rivers as their ancestors had mastered the seas, and no fortress could hold forever against an enemy who could vanish and return without warning. For the peasants, there was no strategy, only survival. They fled inland with whatever they could carry, hiding in the forests until the longships moved on. For the church, the raids were a divine scourge, punishment for the sins of a divided and faithless people. For the kings, they were a humiliation, proof that their power could not shield their subjects. As the Frankish messenger finished his report, the court erupted into anxious voices. Some called for the levies to be raised, others for envoys to be sent. Charles sat silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the arm of his throne. He had heard the stories. He knew the name. And he knew that every decision from this point forward, every coin spent, every sword drawn, would be weighed against the will of one man on the far shore. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, Bjorn Ironside was coming. And Europe was not ready. Long before the dragon ships cast their shadow over Europe's rivers, before kings cursed his name, Bjorn Ironside was a boy in a land that bred warriors. His earliest memories would have been of cold winds off the Baltic, the smell of salt and pine, and the sound of axes biting into wood. This was the world of the Norse, a place where survival was a daily battle, and every horizon invited conquest. Bjorn's origins are shrouded in both legend and history, bound up in the sagas of his father, Ragnar Lothbrok. The chronicles, part fact, part myth, speak of Ragnar as a man larger than life, a raider, a king, a trickster, and a hero whose deeds were sung in longhouses across the north. To be Ragnar's son was to be born into a legacy of expectation and danger. In the mead halls, stories told of Ragnar slaying serpents, outwitting kings, and sailing to lands so distant they might as well have been other worlds. For a boy like Bjorn, such tales were not merely entertainment, they were a blueprint. From his earliest days, he would have been trained to fight, to sail, to endure the elements. Every swing of the practice sword, every day rowing against the wind, was a step toward proving he was worthy of his father's name. The Norse world was a crucible. Winters were long, summers short, and the land unforgiving. Villages clung to the coasts and fjords, their survival dependent on fishing, farming, and raiding. Boys came of age early, tested by the sea, by the hunt, and by the ever-present threat of rival clans. A Viking was forged as much by hardship as by steel. Bjorn's childhood would have been steeped in ritual. Coming-of-age ceremonies were as much about resilience as skill. At feasts, elders recounted the exploits of their ancestors, impressing on the young the sacred duty of honor and reputation. In a world where memory was carried in song, a man's deeds determined whether his name lived on after death. For Bjorn, the weight of legacy was doubled. Not only did he have to live up to Ragnar's fame, but he had to stand apart from his brothers, Hvitserk, Sigurd, Ub, and Ivar. Each was carving their own path through blood and salt water, and the competition between them was fierce. Every raid, every duel, every council was a proving ground. Bjorn's first taste of true war would have come at his father's side in raids against the Saxons or Franks. These early campaigns were more than plunder, they were lessons. He would have learned how to read a coastline, how to strike where the enemy was weakest, and how to withdraw before being trapped. Ragnar was a master of the hit-and-run raid, a style that relied on speed, surprise, and an intimate knowledge of the seas. But Bjorn was different. Even in his youth, he sought more than just quick strikes. He was drawn to the idea of lasting impact, raids that would echo in the minds of his enemies long after the ships were gone. This ambition would become the hallmark of his career. The sagas speak of his early ventures as a young leader, taking command of a small fleet, striking boldly into enemy waters, and returning laden with silver and captives. These were the proving years, when his name began to carry weight beyond his homeland. The elders whispered that Bjorn fought not only with his sword but with his mind, thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead, anticipating the enemy's reaction before they made it. By the time he was a man, Bjorn Ironside had already distinguished himself as more than just Ragnar's son. He had become a leader in his own right, one whose authority was built on victories won with cunning as much as with courage. His warriors followed him not only for loot but because they trusted that, under his command, they would live to fight another day. And yet, these early years were only the beginning. The fjords and islands of the north could no longer contain his ambition. The stories of distant lands, of gold-laden cities, of warm seas, of kingdoms ripe for plunder, called to him. It was not enough to raid the familiar coasts of Saxon England or Francia. Bjorn's eyes were fixed on horizons no Norseman had yet dared to claim. Soon, he would take his first great step into history. Soon, the boy forged in ice and fire would become the storm that shattered Europe's peace. The first time Bjorn Ironside's name truly echoed beyond the north, it was carried on the wind of a raid so daring that even his enemies grudgingly admired it. No longer content with the seasonal strikes that had defined the Viking presence in Europe, Bjorn began to chart a new course, one that would take his longships into the very heart of the continent and eventually, far beyond it. His early independent expeditions targeted Frankish strongholds along the Seine and Loire, but they were not the haphazard plunders of lesser raiders. Bjorn struck like a surgeon, choosing locations where defenses were thin, where rivers funneled ships straight to the soft underbelly of a city. He would arrive at dawn, sails furled, ships gliding silently on the current until the war horn sounded, and chaos erupted. Towns that had been sleeping moments earlier found themselves engulfed in fire and steel. The Frankish annals describe him as immensely cunning, a man who avoided needless losses and left only after securing either rich plunder or crushing tribute. It was a calculated rhythm: strike, vanish, reappear somewhere entirely unexpected. By the time one town began repairing its walls, Bjorn's fleet was already days away, bearing down on another unprepared target. But Bjorn's ambition did not stop at the Frankish rivers. In a move that stunned both allies and enemies, he led his fleet into the Mediterranean, a voyage few Norse leaders dared attempt. Passing through the Strait of Gibraltar, his longships emerged into a world utterly unlike the grey northern seas. Here, the sun blazed hotter, the waters ran deep and blue, and the cities rose like fortresses of stone and marble. The Mediterranean raids became the stuff of legend. Bjorn struck at the coasts of Muslim-ruled Spain, tested the defenses of North Africa, and sailed into the heart of Italy. One of the most famous exploits attributed to him was the assault on the city of Luna in Tuscany. Believing it to be Rome itself, the Vikings laid siege, only to find the city heavily defended. The sagas tell of Bjorn feigning death, having his men request a Christian burial inside the city walls. The ruse worked: his corpse was carried into the heart of Luna, whereupon he leapt from his coffin, sword in hand, and led his men in opening the gates. Historians debate the details, but the essence of the story reveals something true about Bjorn: his genius was not only in warfare, but in deception. He understood the value of striking at the mind as much as the body. These raids were more than simple piracy, they demonstrated the logistical mastery needed to maintain fleets over vast distances, to coordinate supply, and to keep discipline among warriors far from home. Each successful return cemented Bjorn's reputation as the most dangerous man afloat, a leader whose reach extended from the cold fjords of Scandinavia to the sunlit harbors of the south. By the time he turned his gaze back toward Francia, kings across Europe no longer saw him as merely another Viking raider. He had become something far more troubling: a strategist with no fixed borders, no single kingdom to defend, and no predictable pattern to his strikes. He was a phantom in their nightmares, and they knew that when Bjorn Ironside chose his next target, it would be with precision, purpose, and devastating effect. By the late 9th century, Bjorn Ironside was no longer just a name whispered in fear along Europe's rivers, he was a living storm. His fleet, hardened by years of conquest, plunder, and perilous voyages, was the most experienced Viking force in the known world. And now, his eyes turned toward a target so audacious it bordered on madness: Paris. In 885, the city was not yet the sprawling capital it would become, but it was already a jewel of Francia, a wealthy trading hub sitting like a guardian between the Seine's bends. Paris was more than just a city, it was a symbol. If it could be taken, no Frankish stronghold could claim safety. The Vikings did not arrive quietly. The Seine's banks trembled as a fleet of perhaps hundreds of ships advanced upriver, their prows rising like a forest of carved beasts. The sheer number of longships was itself a weapon, each one carrying warriors armed with axes, spears, and the kind of ruthless determination that had broken so many towns before. Paris's defenses were formidable for their time. High walls encircled the Isle de la Cite, and 2 fortified bridges connected the island to the mainland, blocking the river with massive chains. Count Odo of Paris, a commander of rare grit, had been preparing for such a day. His garrison was small compared to the Viking host, but it was disciplined and determined. The first Viking assault came swiftly. Siege engines, built in haste from timber along the Seine, hurled stones and flaming projectiles against the walls. Archers loosed volleys from the decks of their ships, trying to thin the defenders atop the ramparts. But Odo's men responded with equal ferocity, pouring boiling oil over attackers, firing crossbows, and unleashing counter-barrages from within the city. For days, the air above Paris was thick with smoke and the roar of war. The Vikings attempted to storm the bridges, clashing in brutal hand-to-hand combat with the defenders. But the Frankish resistance held. The chains across the river, impossible to break under fire, denied Bjorn's fleet the swift entry it had hoped for. Realizing brute force alone would not break Paris, Bjorn adapted. He ordered a siege, encircling the city, cutting off supplies, and waiting for hunger to do what swords could not. Months dragged on. The defenders, though resolute, began to wither under the strain. Grain stores dwindled. Disease crept through the narrow streets. The winter cold seeped into bones. Yet even the besiegers suffered. The Vikings were far from home, their supply lines stretched, their warriors restless. Frankish relief forces prowled the countryside, harassing smaller Viking bands that strayed too far from the main camp. The siege had become a test of endurance as much as strength. Then came the turning point. In the spring, Charles the Fat, ruler of the Carolingian Empire, finally moved to relieve the city. But rather than lead a decisive battle to crush the Vikings, he chose negotiation. The terms were humiliating for Francia. The Vikings would be paid a massive tribute in silver to leave Paris untouched and sail away to raid Burgundy instead. Bjorn accepted. For him, this was victory of the highest order. Without losing his fleet to a costly battle, he had extracted not only wealth but a political concession from the most powerful man in Europe. The message was clear, even the mightiest kings preferred paying Bjorn to fighting him. The psychological blow to Francia was immense. If Paris, the unbreakable city, could be brought to its knees, not through conquest but through sheer pressure, then no fortress was truly safe. Bjorn's legend swelled. To his men, he was the ultimate commander, one who could turn a siege into a triumph without sacrificing his warriors to pointless slaughter. As the longships slipped away from the Seine, laden with silver, the people of Paris emerged from behind their walls. They were alive, yes, but they knew it was not because they had defeated the storm. The storm had chosen to pass them by, and that was perhaps more terrifying than destruction itself. For years, Bjorn Ironside had dictated the terms of war. Kings bent under the weight of his demands, cities shuttered their gates at the sight of his sails, and rivers that had once carried trade now carried only the memory of his passing. But the very scale of his success was sowing the seeds of resistance. Europe's rulers, humiliated and bled of silver, began to adapt. In Francia, coastal fortifications were expanded, watchtowers sprouted along riverbanks, and fortified bridges, modeled after Paris's successful defense, appeared in key choke points. Smaller kingdoms formed defensive pacts, setting aside old rivalries in the face of a common threat. Even the church, long a target of Viking plunder, began funding militias and fortresses with the wealth that once lay unguarded in monasteries. Bjorn's return raids now met stiffer resistance. Where once villages scattered at the sight of his ships, armed men now stood on the shore ready to defend their homes. The element of surprise, his most potent weapon, was slowly eroding. News traveled faster along improved communication routes, the warning cry of Vikings. Could now reach inland strongholds before the raiders arrived. One campaign in particular marked the shift. Seeking to repeat the triumphs of his earlier years, Bjorn led his fleet into the heart of Francia once again. But this time, The rivers he had once sailed unopposed were blocked by reinforced chains and watchposts bristling with archers. His ships took volleys of arrows before they could even close on the shore. When his men attempted to land, they found not scattered farmers but organized militias, warriors drilled in resisting Viking tactics. The fighting was fierce but inconclusive. Bjorn withdrew, not because he had been decisively beaten, but because the cost of victory had risen sharply. He could no longer sweep through the land with impunity, every raid now demanded greater risk. Politics too began to complicate his campaigns. The alliances he had forged with other Viking leaders were fragile, often strained by disputes over loot, strategy, and prestige. Rival chieftains resented his growing fame, and some sought to undermine him. In certain raids, promised reinforcements failed to appear. In others, spoils were contested so bitterly that men who had fought side by side days earlier turned their blades on each other. Whispers of Bjorn's mortality began to circulate. Age was catching him, if only in subtle ways, the scars that ached in cold weather, the slower rise from his seat, the moments when he let others lead the charge. He was still formidable, still feared, but the myth of invincibility was beginning to crack. Even so, kings did not relax. They knew that a wounded predator was often the most dangerous. Every fortification raised, every levy called, was done with one man in mind. And for Bjorn, each new barrier he encountered was not just a military obstacle, it was a sign that the game he had dominated for decades was changing. The tide was turning. The question was no longer whether Europe could resist him, but whether Bjorn Ironside could adapt to a world that had finally learned how to fight the storm. The end of Bjorn Ironside's life is as clouded in legend as the beginning. The sagas give us fragments. Some say he died peacefully in his homeland, surrounded by kin and the wealth of decades. Others insist he fell in battle, his body carried away so his enemies could never display it as a trophy. History offers no certainty, only the echo of his name across centuries. What is clear is that, by the time of his death, Bjorn had carved himself into the map of European memory. He was more than a raider, he was a commander who reshaped the way war was fought. His campaigns demonstrated that mobility, surprise, and psychological warfare could topple even the strongest defenses. He had forced kings to change how they thought, how they built, and how they ruled. For the rulers of Europe, Bjorn's passing was both a relief and a warning. His absence removed the most dangerous player from the game, but it left behind the tactics, strategies, and ambitions that others would imitate. Viking fleets continued to prowl the rivers for decades after, carrying with them the lessons of Ironside's reign of terror. In the north, his legacy was enshrined in saga and song. Skalds recited his victories to roaring fires, telling how he sailed farther than any before him, how he outwitted kings, and how he never bowed to the will of another man. These stories were not just entertainment, they were blueprints for the next generation. His descendants and fellow Norse leaders carried his methods into their own campaigns, spreading the fear he had inspired across new territories. In Francia and beyond, his memory took a different shape. To monks and chroniclers, he was a scourge sent by God to punish disunity and sin. To peasants, he was the shadow on the horizon, proof that no wall was high enough, no king strong enough, to guarantee safety. Even after his death, his name could silence a crowded hall. Centuries later, when Europe's political map had changed and the Viking Age had faded into history, Bjorn Ironside still lingered in the collective imagination. His raids were retold not merely as acts of war, but as moments when the established order trembled. He had been a man without borders in a world obsessed with them, a force of nature who moved wherever the rivers and seas could carry him. And perhaps that is why his legend endures. Bjorn Ironside was not just a warrior who terrified Europe's kings, he was a reminder that in every age there are leaders who rewrite the rules, who refuse to be contained, and who leave behind a legacy that blurs the line between fear and awe. The kings of his time may have thought they were paying him to go away. In truth, they were paying for him to be remembered.